Elbrus, located in Russia, is a dormant stratovolcano that last erupted over 25 million years ago. At an altitude of 5,642 meters, Elbrus stands as the highest mountain in Europe and makes up one of the 7 summit mountains in the continent. Unlike Everest and K2, with their deep crevasses and rocky ridges, Elbrus is not considered particularly challenging or dangerous to climb. The thing about Elbrus is that it's a trekkable mountain. It doesn't have difficult terrain that requires ropes or ice pockets to climb on. For this reason, the mountain attracts thousands of visitors from all over the world looking to tick their box of a summit push. Friends and office workers climb the mountain as a bonding or team-building activity. The mountain has 2 main peaks which can be accessed from all sides: the eastern summit at 5,621 meters and the western summit at 5,642 meters. So how did this seemingly unchallenging mountain claim the lives of 6 experienced mountain climbers in 1990? 90% of tragic incidents on climbing expeditions usually start with a sudden change in weather, and this one isn't any different. In May 1993, a group of 6 men set out for an acclimatization trip on Mount Elbrus. They were all experienced mountain climbers, and the trip was supposed to take only a few hours. Leading the group were Sergei, Levin, a professional mountain climber, and Sergei Farbstein, a medical doctor. Levin's group was part of a tour of visiting tourists to Elbrus. They were the safety group for the tourists, and the acclimatization trip was to familiarize themselves with the route and ensure that they were ready to respond to any emergencies during the main expedition. So, on the 2nd of May, these men leave Shelter 11 and begin their walk from the eastern side of the mountain. For context, Shelter 11 is a camp-like hotel built for climbers to rest and regain their strength on the mountain. The shelter is built at 4,050 meters and is well insulated with comfortable rooms to protect climbers from the howling wind. Anyway, the men had no plans to reach the summit, so they did not carry much gear, just a few basic supplies that included snacks and water to last them a short while. Judging by the clear skies above, they were confident that they would complete the tour quicker than they expected. On their way up, they met another group of climbers going down. That group had reached the summit and were now heading back to the shelter. A small conversation ensues, and they talk about the clear skies and how the weather has been decent for climbing the past few days. Before they depart, Levin tells them that his group will climb a little higher before they head back down. After walking for another 40 minutes, Levin and his men decide to rest and eat their snacks. At this point, they are already about 4,500 meters up the mountain. Shelter 11 is still in sight, but oxygen levels have reduced by half of what it was at sea level. While they're waiting, they notice that the weather below had suddenly deteriorated and a snowstorm had started, enveloping the entire area, leading to Shelter 11 in a fog. The thing with high-altitude mountains like Elbrus is that the weather is highly unpredictable, and the storms up here are 10 times fiercer than when you are at sea level. Levin and his men knew that it would be suicidal to continue their ascent up the mountain, but even going back down was a dangerous attempt. A thick fog had enveloped the area below, blocking their view of the route that led to Shelter 11. If they tried to go down, they would be walking blindly in the snow due to the low visibility, and could easily lose their way, even for experienced climbers like them. The only thing they could do was wait for the storm to pass, but even that was another problem. The men didn't have a tent or supplies to set up camp with. This was supposed to be a short acclimatization trip that should have only taken a few hours up the mountain and back. Carrying a tent for such a short trip was typically unnecessary and would have only slowed the carrier down. The men knew they had to do something, otherwise they would be caught in the middle of the storm, unprotected. As they stood there, contemplating what to do, Levin, the group leader, suddenly had an idea. He had climbed Elbrus more times than the others and knew that there was a rocky opening on the slopes. Quickly, he led the men to what looked like a cave, but the entrance was filled with snow. The men proceeded to dig the snow out to make enough room for themselves. They weren't too worried about the situation. This wasn't their first rodeo, and they were confident that the storm would let up by the following day. The cave wasn't warmer than a tent, but it was better than being out in the cold snow. Thankfully, they had a camp stove to keep them warm through the night, and still had some of their snacks left from the afternoon. After they had all settled in, Levin radioed the management in Shelter 11 to report their situation. He told them that they had found a cave and would pass the night there before continuing their descent in the morning. But morning came, and the weather still did not improve. The men headed out anyway, confident that they could brave the storm and get themselves down to the shelter. Outside, the cave was much colder than they expected. The snowstorm was still raging fiercely, and the entire mountain was covered in fresh snow. The force from the wind was also battering them from all sides, causing their faces to go numb from the cold. Soon, the enthusiasm with which the men started the descent started to wane. Their steps were getting slower, and Levin could see the exhaustion in the men's eyes. 10 minutes later, they still hadn't gotten any farther from the cave. Farbstein in particular couldn't see clearly without his glasses and kept slipping on the icy slopes, slowing the team down even further. Levin looked up towards the cave and down the mountain. They were still about 500 meters away from Shelter 11, and with the men's current state, a successful descent was starting to seem unlikely. Even if the other men still had the strength to push through the wind, what about Farbstein, who could barely see? Levin saw that their best option was to get back into the comfort of the cave, which was warmer, rather than risk their lives inside the raging storm. He rallied the men around, and after a brief deliberation, they all decided to go back into the cave for shelter. On their way back to the cave, they ran into two Japanese climbers who had lost their way in the storm. The two had also been caught in the storm the previous day and had passed the night in a tent. According to them, they would have waited the storm out or until help came, but the strong wind had uprooted their tent, and they had been forced to continue. Not familiar with Elbrus, they had strayed away from the route and found themselves near the cave. The foreigners were cold and badly frostbitten, and they were almost at the point of succumbing to the cold when they saw Levin's group. With the addition of the two foreigners, the cave was now a bit crowded. However, it remained warm thanks to their camp stove. But the men were starting to feel sick from the low oxygen they had been enduring for the past few hours. It was still the morning of the 3rd of May when they returned to the cave, and the thought of staying through the evening until the next morning was quite discomforting. They couldn't move around in the cave either, because the second chamber they dug the previous day had collapsed. Now, all 8 men were lying around the stove in the first chamber. They had spent the previous night on the cold, hard floor and hadn't eaten any hot food in such cold weather. The combination of minimal food and the cold was starting to take its toll on them, but they were hopeful that the storm would let up by the next day. Levin again radios the management back at Shelter 11, but for some strange reason does not explain the gravity of their situation. He tells them that everyone in his group was fine, and they had in fact rescued 2 other climbers up the mountain and had offered them shelter in the cave. Judging by Levin's reassurance that the men were safe, the management in Shelter 11 made no attempt to search for or rescue them. It would be difficult to do so even if they wanted to, because the storm was still raging outside. However, later that evening, they got an alarming message from Levin. "We are counting on support," was all he said. The message was both alarming and baffling. Levin had been assuring them that he and his group were safe, and considering the fact that he was an experienced climber and also was a rescue guide, this could only mean that the men up the mountain had underestimated their situation and were now in critical condition. The management immediately dispatches a search and rescue team to go find Levin's group, but the storm outside was still fierce, making the mission impossible. The rescue team hadn't gone for long before they were forced to retreat back to Shelter 11. Levin and his men had no choice but to stay in the cave for the second night. But this decision turned out to be fatal. Before they slept that night, a series of events occurred that totally changed the trajectory of the men's otherwise manageable condition. Firstly, the cave's entrance was gradually getting filled up with snow, blocking the little oxygen that was getting in and making it increasingly difficult for the men to breathe. The men decided to dig the snow out before it totally blocked the cave's entrance. But not all of them could go outside in the wind again. The Japanese men were still badly frostbitten, and so was Farbstein, whose health had terribly deteriorated that he couldn't walk by himself. 2 other men, Odinsov and Oleg Buldakov, were also suffering from altitude sickness. It wasn't as bad as Farbstein's, but Oleg Buldakov was affected psychologically and wasn't acting like his normal self. In the end, only the strongest of them, which included Levin and 2 other men, crawled out to clear the snow blocking the entrance. The next morning, Odintsov woke up to see that the 3 men who had gone out to clear the entrance from outside were not in the cave. One of the Japanese men was missing as well. Buldakov and Farbstein were huddled up in a corner. They were conscious, but they were still sick and could barely move their legs. Odintsov decided to get out of the cave. The entrance was still blocked, and he only managed to crawl out after an hour of digging through the snow. Thankfully, the storm had stopped, and the weather outside was brighter. He could even see Shelter 11 from afar. But there was something else he was seeing. Not far from the cave's entrance were the bodies of Levin and the 2 other men who had gone out the previous night to clear the entrance. Not knowing what to make of the situation, Odintsov started to descend the mountain to get help. On his way down, he met a search and rescue team looking for the Japanese men. Odintsov pointed them in the direction of the cave and continued his descent. Rescuers got to the cave and found the bodies of 3 men near the entrance. The entrance to the cave was almost filled up with snow, and they could see signs of how Odintsov had crawled his way out. The rescuers then proceeded to clear the entrance in order to rescue the people whom Odintsov said were still in there. When they got in, they found 3 men lying almost unconscious in the cave: Buldakov, Farbstein, and the Japanese man. They proceeded to take them back to Shelter 11, but Buldakov died on the way. Farbstein was taken to Shelter 11, but he never regained consciousness. He died of hypothermia. Only the Japanese man was safely transported to Shelter 11, where he and Odintsov made a rapid recovery. The second Japanese man was later found, frozen in an ice crack near the cave. Apparently he had gained some strength and tried to make his way to the shelter, but in the dead of the night had fallen into an ice crack and froze to death. It wasn't until much later that they started to investigate the mystery of what happened to Levin and the 2 men outside the cave, and why all of them didn't have either their clothes or boots on. Medical examinations concluded that they died of general hypothermia, but the circumstances in which they were found was too strange for anyone to simply accept their deaths as prolonged exposure to cold. What follows is a list of things discovered, which cast a mysterious cloud over the whole incident. The strangest discovery during the investigation was the human hair found in the stomach of one of the 3 men outside the cave. How it got there cannot be explained. Some people theorized that the doctor, Farbstein, had injected them with some drug he was testing to improve their endurance level in the cold, but the test had backfired, causing them to become irrational and aggressive. A pool of blood which had frozen was also found inside the cave. Whether this had something to do with the wound on Buldakov's face or someone vomited blood from poisoning remains a mystery. A broken walkie-talkie that looked like it was forcefully smashed on a rock was found a few meters away from the cave's entrance. Considering the fact that Levin was the leader of the group and had the walkie-talkie with him, could he have intentionally damaged the walkie-talkie for an ulterior motive? Or had a fight ensued while the men were digging outside the cave, causing the walkie-talkie to get broken in the process? Additionally, the rescuers found 52 ice screws inside the cave. For a trekkable mountain like Elbrus that did not need much climbing, why did they have so many hooks? Were they involved in some shady business that they didn't want people to find out and used the acclimatization trip as a front? Ice screws were valuable back then and often used as currency in exchange for boots or clothing. Could that be why Levin was not completely honest about their situation? Some of the men's expensive equipments were missing, as reported by their families. Whether this was taken by the rescue team or some other group remains a mystery. Most importantly, why was Levin not upfront to the management about their situation in the cave? And what did Odintsov discuss with the leader of the rescue team? It is said that a long conversation ensued between them, and Odintsov altered his testimony shortly after. There were too many unanswered questions, and people began to speculate what could have happened. The most popular verdict is the medical report that stated that the men outside the cave had died of general hypothermia, a prolonged exposure to cold. Even though this still does not answer many of the strange clues discovered, It is the closest to presenting a logical progression from their second night in the cave, up till the morning when they were discovered by the rescuers. Imagine the following sequence of events. The atmosphere in the cave was already poorly ventilated. The gasoline vapors from the stove could have been poisoning them slowly, considering the fact that it was burning in a constricted space. As the snow continues to fill the cave, 3 of the men unable to breathe crawl out of the cave and are instantly hit by the cold air outside the cave. Their physical and psychological consciousness is already affected by the effects of the cold, so they are unable to comprehend what their body is processing. The hypothermia kicks in, and they make irrational decisions like removing their boots and clothes, aka paradoxical undressing, before going back into the cave. They lay down on the snow and fall asleep, never waking up. The cold killed the 3 men, and that's why they were found outside the cave with ice growths on their faces. Surprisingly, not far from Levin's group in the cave was a group of young, inexperienced climbers who had also been caught in the bad weather. They were badly frostbitten, but had survived the storm in their tent without any serious injuries or death. How was it that these inexperienced climbers had managed to survive what almost wiped out a whole group of experienced climbers? Could it be because their shelter was well ventilated, or because they had acclimatized better? The 2 survivors, Odintsov and the Japanese man's testimonies, didn't help much with the investigation. Odintsov was even reported to have changed his testimony after the discussion he had with the leader of the rescue team on the mountain. The case of Levin and the men is shrouded in more mystery than answers, and the more we try to unravel the clues, the more questions we'll come up with. Much of what happened that night is clear to some extent. What we don't know is how, or why it happened.